Economy is security. That was the takeaway message from this week's summit of the so-called Quad group of Indo-Pacific nations that includes the US, Japan, India and Australia. It comes amid rising tensions between the world's two largest economies. The US President Joe Biden's administration is taking aim at what it describes as China's attempt to reshape the international order. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Beijing is engaging in provocative rhetoric and activity, and he's calling on countries in the region to join ranks with Washington to keep China's ambitions in check.
The United States does not want to sever China's economy from ours or from the global economy, though Beijing, despite its rhetoric, is pursuing asymmetric decoupling, seeking to make China less dependent on the world and the world more dependent on China. Beijing's vision would move us away from the universal values that have sustained so much of the world's progress over the past 75 years.
Well, Blinken's comments have drawn a rebuke from Beijing. Chinese officials accuse Washington of running a smear campaign and undermining international law.
This lengthy and carefully crafted speech by Secretary Blinken is essentially spreading disinformation, hyping up the China threat theory, meddling in China's internal affairs, and smearing China's domestic and foreign policy.
Blinken's comments come after the Quad nations plus 9 other countries launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. The IPEF is an agreement designed to lay the groundwork for rules around the digital economy and supply chains in the region. But Biden has faced criticism at home for not announcing a plan to deal with China's rising influence in the Indo-Pacific. Biden says his freshly announced pact will help fight inflation and tackle the climate crisis. But as Suhail Damuni reports, it could stoke further tensions between Washington and Beijing.
Nearly a year and a half after becoming US President, Joe Biden is on his first tour of Asia. And he's hoping to make it count by forging a deal with a dozen countries in the region that he says will boost economic cooperation.
The United States and Japan, together with 11 other nations, will be launching the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This framework is a commitment to working with our close friends and partners in the region on challenges that matter most to ensuring economic competitiveness in the 21st century.
It's Washington's second attempt at bolstering ties with the region after Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump, pulled out of a similar deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, back in 2017. At the time, Trump said that the deal would jeopardize the US economy by shifting jobs overseas. But Biden and his allies are arguing the opposite.
In the infrastructure sector, we announced that we will aim to invest more than $50 billion over the next 5 years to assist projects in the Indo-Pacific region.
The 13 countries that have signed up together, they represent 40% of the world's GDP. Officials say commerce with these countries employs more than 3 million Americans, and the pact will address supply chain constraints and other challenges impeding trade. Members will also develop mechanisms to curb money laundering and tax evasion. The plan to boost US influence in the region is irking Beijing, which accuses Washington of stoking tensions in Taiwan and the South China Sea. And many in South Korea and Japan also oppose the deal.
Their actions are extremely dangerous now. Japan and the US are trying to conduct a war of aggression on China.
I think the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is dangerous. It will do harm to Japan.
While that isn't deterring their governments from joining the pact, analysts say so far few details have been agreed about how to achieve their stated goals. Biden concluded his tour in Tokyo with a summit of the Quad, a separate alliance with India, Japan and Australia. His administration hopes the partnerships will counter China's growing influence in the region. But until officials can flesh out the details of their pact, it's not clear what exactly they're signing up for. Suhail Damuni, TRT World.
Well, let's get more on this now with Christian Lawrence. He's a senior cross-asset strategist at Rabobank in New York, and joining us from Bengaluru in India is business strategy specialist Harish Bijou. A big welcome to you both. Christian, if I could start with you. The US really is looking like it wants to re-engage with the Indo-Pacific region, but it is going to take a lot more than the occasional visit to the Indo-Pacific by the US president. What more can Washington do in order to step up its economic engagement in the region, do you think?
Well, I do think that this new proposal, obviously we're still quite light on details, but essentially this is about geopolitical trade diversion rather than tariff lowering trade creation. And essentially it is the US's way to try and gain more influence in the region, but of course excluding China. Now, the previous trade agreements that we've seen, things like the TPP, which became the CPTPP, of course, that does include China, but notably it doesn't include the US and India, and is only around about 11% of GDP. So really, this is, to me, it's a function of what we're seeing globally, which is a change in the way trade works. I'm not so keen on the term deglobalization, but certainly the trade political plates, if you will, are starting to diverge, and we are looking at a world that is going to be very different to the pre-COVID world.
And Harish, even those countries that do have growing apprehensions about China's rise in the region and its strategic objectives, even they acknowledge they can't simply just sever ties with the Chinese economy. For example, we have countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and even India that have territorial disputes, but economically they are inextricably linked with China's economy at the moment. How do you think countries in the Indo-Pacific should navigate their economic relationship with China, even though the political situation might be a bit fraught?
The fact is that geography is not history anymore, because all of a sudden geography seems to become the future. Because this Indo-Pacific, it is all about the Indo-Pacific trade architecture. It's about saying that, hey, listen, we are going to create a new agglomeration of nations without China. Now, how does one deal with China? I think, it's going to be business as usual when it comes to dealing with China on commercial terms. But in terms of emotional terms and in terms of political alignment, this is going to define and say that the world now stands not on four legs. The four legs were originally the United States, China, India, and Japan in that order. So we are a three-legged race in this particular pact. And I think it clearly says that China is not in it, and China is an entity outside of it all. So I think this is going to rankle within China, among the Chinese people for sure. But I think it's creating a new world order altogether, saying that the salience of the emerging region of the entire set of nations of Indo-Pacific is going to grow. And this means after the United Nations, this is going to be the largest organization, because the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean touch large numbers, swathes of countries.
Now, Christian, the US had already sharpened its approach to China under Barack Obama's administration and certainly under Donald Trump's trade war. Now, Trump's thinking at the time in launching tariffs against China was that if any economy in the world could take on China, it would be the United States, which has a more superior and bigger economy on paper. But as we saw at the time, certain industries in the United States did take a significant hit as China retaliated with its own tariffs. But how would you describe the economic relationship between the US and China right now? And can the US even afford to cut ties with China economically, even in the longer term?
Well, I would argue that this goes well beyond economics and really moves deeply into the political space, which always trumps economics. And the bottom line here is that this is a battle for global hegemony. The US is the world's #1 superpower. China has been very clear that it wants to become the world's #1 superpower. So it's natural that we will see the two countries at loggerheads, and we will see tensions rise periodically. We will also see, I'm sure, periods where those tensions start to dissipate again. But the bottom line is this is a story that we will be talking about in 5 years. This is a story we will be talking about in 10 years, because it is the battle for global hegemony. It goes beyond any tariffs. It goes beyond any small developments we see. This is a very much a long-term theme that is going to dominate the geopolitical space for many years to come. And I'd actually argue that Russia-Ukraine really accelerates that dynamic as well, because we're already seeing some of these political power plates start to move and move at a faster pace as a result of the conflict there, which I think is, in a way, a kind of manifestation of the global stresses that we're seeing.
Now, Harish, can I ask you more about the India-China relationship more specifically? Because we know that China is India's largest trading partner at the moment. Trade between the two countries has grown exponentially since the turn of the century to reach about $95 billion in 21 and 22. But India, as I mentioned earlier, does have quite a sensitive relationship with China right now, stemming from things like territorial disputes in the Himalayas, as well as China's ongoing support for India's traditional foe, Pakistan. So can I ask you, how do you see the relationship between India and China developing over the coming years, the economic relationship that is? Do you see those ties deepening, or is India really looking to try and wean itself from Beijing's economy?
You know, China seems to have emerged as a country which India can't do without and can't live with. And that is the truth, because, you know, a lot of us, a lot of Indian businesses depend very, very heavily on supply chain efficiencies that occur within China. And that's not going to change, because our balance of payments is attuned to that traditionally, and it's going to continue going that way. However, one thing that's happening, one thing that's occurring is this is not only economic activity, but it's also diplomacy. When it comes to diplomacy, I think a certain kind of economic detente is established, in the sense that, you know, if you can't do without a nation's produce, then you might as well have a situation where you say that goods will come in and goods will go out. Maybe I'll bring in more goods from there, but it's good for my economy. And I think that's where India stands. However, if you look at the fact, around India, there are n numbers of countries which have got into a kind of a Chinese debt trap. And Sri Lanka is a classic example of that. It's come to a situation where the economy has collapsed. And I think India is being the big brother in this terrain. So I do believe this is really going to be about, yes, trade architecture, but it's also going to be about the politics of the region, where India emerges the big brother.
And we will have to leave it there. But Christian Lawrence and Harish Bajwa, we really appreciate your analysis. Thank you again for joining us on Money Talks.
Thank you.
Thank you.